Barely a week after halting debate performance that may go down as one of the most damaging in modern American history, the U.S. president is fighting for his political survival under intense domestic and global scrutiny. Analysts are saying the three-day summit in Washington, D.C. may be his path to a temporary reprieve or president's last stand. In the past few days, President Biden has railed against his critics, claiming the mandate of Democratic primary voters, challenging opponents to step forward and try to unseat him. He has promised repeatedly that he is moving ahead with his campaign and that the time for second-guessing and hand-wringing is over, while the pressing ahead will start at the NATO summit. But the U.S. president will host alliance leaders for 3 days of meetings and public events, culminating into a solo press conference, and that will happen on Thursday afternoon. Well ahead of the NATO summit in Washington, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz says that he has no concern about the fitness of U.S. President Joe Biden. According to Mr. Scholz, from many conversations he has had with the American president, Mr. Biden has prepared his summit very well and very precisely together with them. Mr. Scholz made these few comments at Berlin Airport before boarding his official government plane ahead to the United States. And Russia says its eyes are on the NATO summit. The Kremlin has said it will closely follow the meeting because the alliance had declared Moscow its enemy and sought to defeat Russia. According to Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, Russia considered NATO, which is holding a summit in Washington, to be fully involved in the conflict in Ukraine. Arming Ukraine's air defenses is expected to top the agenda at that summit, marking NATO's 75th anniversary after missile strikes on Monday hit a children's hospital in Kiev. Mr. Peskov says that NATO has regularly declared its aim in conflict to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia on the battlefield. It is now taking part directly in the Ukrainian conflict on the side of Ukraine. And as NATO allies meet in Washington, as we told you earlier this week, the White House says that it has not seen signs that NATO allies coming to Washington for a summit needed any assurance about President Joe Biden's ability to do his job after his shaky debate performance against Mr. Donald Trump last month. The White House spokesperson, John Kirby, told reporters during the briefing that they are very excited about this summit. The summit, which celebrates 75 years of the greatest defensive alliance in history, has been described as a crucial one as worries among NATO allies have grown since Mr. Biden fumbled a June 2017 debate. But the gathering is also meant to showcase the leadership of U.S. President Joe Biden, who has constantly rallied NATO allies to show new unity and purpose in the face of Russian President Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
That's because I think the question presupposes the notion that they need to be reassured of American leadership and President Biden's commitment, and I don't believe that's the case. We're not picking up any signs of that from our allies at all, quite the contrary. The conversations that we're having with them in advance, they're excited about this summit, they're excited about the possibilities and the things that we're going to be doing together, specifically to help Ukraine. In the last 3 years, rather than browbeaten and insulting and demeaning allies, this president has invested in allies and partnerships. And when he took office, what I said, only nine allies had reached the 2% level. Now 23. That's not by accident. That's because of leadership. That's because of constant stewardship of the alliance and other partnerships around the world. The president's record speaks for itself, and the allies and the non-NATO friends and partners that are coming as well, they know that. They wouldn't be coming. New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, to a NATO summit if they didn't believe in American leadership and how important it is, and if they didn't believe that President Biden takes that responsibility extremely seriously.
Meanwhile, President Joe Biden will hold his first face-to-face talks with Britain's new Prime Minister Keir Starmer at the White House. In what appears to be a busy week for the U.S. president, Mr. Biden will also host an event on Thursday with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the NATO summit taking place in Washington. President Biden's ability has been called to question weeks after a debate appeared in favor of former President Donald Trump ahead of the November 5 elections later this year. While much of the attention will focus on him amid growing calls within his own party to step aside, NATO delegates are expected to have a full agenda focused on military and financial aid for Ukraine and offering some pathway towards its eventual NATO membership.
On Wednesday, the President will hold his first bilateral meeting with the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, here at the White House. The President will also meet with the 32 members of the alliance at the Convention Center. And then later that evening, he and Dr. Biden will host NATO leaders for a dinner again here at the White House. On Thursday morning, NATO will hold a meeting with the EU and with NATO's Indo-Pacific partners, that's Australia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and New Zealand, to deepen our cooperation. And then on Thursday afternoon, there'll be a meeting of the NATO-Ukraine Council, after which the President will host an event with President Zelensky and nearly 24 of our allies and partners who have signed bilateral security agreements with Ukraine, just as the President did, as you saw in Italy a week or so ago. To strengthen Ukraine's air defenses and to help Ukraine protect its cities and its grid, the United States and several of our allies will have several big announcements at this week's summit. And the NATO alliance will announce significant new steps to strengthen its military and political partnership with Ukraine to help Ukraine continue to defend themselves today and to deter Russian aggression well into the future.
Security measures are heightened and tightened around the D.C. Convention Center that is playing host to the NATO summit. The 75th anniversary of the NATO meeting, primarily held at the Washington Convention Center and other locations, including the White House, is expected to bring significant traffic impact, including street and pedestrian closures. Rows of fences, along with heavy police presence, have been deployed outside the Washington Convention Center to bolster security. The fences are fortified around the area, which is monitored by law enforcement officers. Banners and signs of the event are also displayed, along with instruction signs to ensure security for that venue. Over 3 days, the 32 NATO allies will focus on key topics, including deterrence and defense, support for Ukraine, strengthening global partnerships, and NATO's founding treaty was signed in the U.S. Capitol in April 1949 with 12 member countries. And to other stories now, one clear voter's choice and voting pattern in the forthcoming U.S. election will be between supporters of gun ownership and those vehemently against it. At the Alpine shooting range in the Fort Worth, Texas, support for Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump is obvious and it's open. Larry Collins, who's a Republican supporter and a pro-gun advocate, accused the Democrats of doing everything they can to take guns away from the people. According to Collins, Biden's bid to take guns away from people would mean that no gun owner anywhere would have ever to vote for him. In May this year, at the National Rifle Association's annual leadership forum in Dallas, Texas, President Trump had urged gun supporters to go to the polls in November election and pledged to unravel gun regulations put in place by Democratic President Joe Biden. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi says the relationship with Russia is based on mutual trust and mutual respect. Speaking during an address to the city's Indian diaspora as part of his first visit to Russia in 5 years, Prime Minister Modi says that he is very happy with the two nations and that they are working shoulder to shoulder to give new energy to global prosperity. Eulogizing Russian President, Mr. Modi praised Vladimir Putin's leadership and lauded the commitment of the two countries to emerge stronger in good and bad times. The Indian leader also laid a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Moscow, paying tribute to the Russian military's fallen soldiers. Prime Minister Modi's two-day visit coincides with the NATO summit in Washington, which is expected to dominate by the Ukrainian war. Members of the Indian community and Moscow residents have celebrated Indian Prime Minister Modi's arrival in Russia with music and dances. A visibly cheerful crowd gathered across the street of the Carlton Hotel, where Mr. Modi and the Indian delegation will be staying during the visit to Russia. Indian Prime Minister is in Moscow for a two-day state visit where he's expected to hold informal face-to-face talks with the Russian President Vladimir Putin, and as part of talks between the two leaders fixing India's trade imbalance with Russia, securing the discharge of Indian citizens who were misled into fighting the Ukrainian conflict hold all top priorities in Moscow.
Thank you. Send me the picture.
Prime Minister Keir Starmer has hosted his first roundtable discussion with regional English mayors, where he started and stated a commitment to devolution and proposed the establishment of a formal council of regions and nations. Prime Minister Starmer, while addressing the mayors, says that he is a great believer in devolution and in the idea that those with skin in the game, those that know their communities, make much better decisions than people sitting in Westminster and Whitehall. Among those who Starmer and his deputy, Angela Rayner, met included London's Sadiq Khan, West Midlands' Richard Parker, Greater Manchester's Andy Burnham, Liverpool City Regent Steve Rotherham, East Midlands' Claire Ward, and North East's Kim McGuinness.
I'm a great believer in devolution. I'm a great believer in the idea that those with skin in the game, those that know their communities, make much better decisions than people sitting in Westminster and Whitehall. We will set up a council for regions and nations. Now, I don't want to overly formalise it, but I do want a degree of formality so that it's a meeting that everybody knows is a meeting where business is done, where decisions are properly recorded and actioned.
Victorious French political leaders from the left-wing bloc that came first in Sunday's legislative election say they intend to govern according to their high-spending program. The unexpected outcome of the snap elections have plunged France into uncertainty just before the Paris Olympics, with no obvious path to a stable government capable of getting any legislation passed by a fragmented parliament. The left-wing New Popular Front won the most seats in the National Assembly but fell short of an absolute majority by about 100 seats. President Emmanuel Macron's centrist came second and the far-right National Rally came third. NFP leaders have met behind closed doors several times since the shock result came out on Sunday, that's July the 7th night, attempting to trash out an agreement on which of them should be Prime Minister and how they should approach governing without a majority. In the meantime, French authorities and brands are intensifying a crackdown on counterfeits ahead of the Olympics kicking off in 2 weeks. On the outskirts of Paris's touristy Saint-Ouen Fair market, at the flea market there, one morning police officers swarmed and shut down stores selling counterfeits, including fake Louis Vuitton and Nike products, confiscated and destroyed 63,000 items of clothing, shoes and leather goods on the spot, and arrested 10 people. According to French authorities, the goal is to ensure no fake Olympic merchandise is available ahead or during the Games, but also to tackle counterfeit products unrelated to the Olympics. According to the International Olympic Committee, the most faked Olympic products are clothing and items reproducing the mascot. The IOC and Paris 2024 both joined French Brand Protection Group Union ahead of those Games. With millions of extra visitors expected this summer to Paris and other host cities like Lille and Marseille, the potential market for fake branded clothes, bags and shoes is significant, and visitors to France frequently seek out luxury goods from brands like Louis Vuitton and Chanel, but those that cannot afford the real thing could be tempted by cheaper fakes. The UN Human Rights Chief says that his office is following up on reports of mass grave discovered in the desert along the Libya-Tunisia border, giving a speech where he denounced a series of disturbing developments in Libya. Volker Turk told the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, Switzerland in the month of March that at least 65 migrant bodies were discovered in a mass grave in southwest Libya. He is urging authorities to respond swiftly to UN inquiries and to investigate the crimes and violations against migrants and refugees. Palestinians dug through the rubble on Tuesday, searching for those killed in an Israeli airstrike on the building in Al-Nuseirat, scrambling to pull out the dead using their bare hands and limited tools. Health officials in the Hamas-run territory said across Gaza, Israeli strikes killed nearly 30 Palestinians on Tuesday. Israeli airstrikes killed 6 people in the house in the Gaza city, at least 9 in 2 houses in Al-Nuseirat and Deir al-Bala in central Gaza, 3 people in Rafah on the Gazan Strips in southern edge. Gaza health officials are saying their latest update on Tuesday, which is a Palestinian death toll in the 9-month-long Israeli military offensive, has now reached 38,243. The war was triggered when fighters led by Hamas attacked southern Israel on October the 7th, 2023, killing 1,200 people and taking around 250 hostages, according to Israeli figures. We'll take a look at the environment now. Hot and humid conditions behind several recent deaths in Japan have driven presidents to use new cooling shelters set up around the capital on Tuesday, including at popular tourist spots in Tokyo Tower. Typically, facilities such as community centers or libraries equipped with air conditioners. The shelters are part of a scheme adopted this year that require local government to provide people with a respite after the heat from warnings got out. But authorities in Japan had warned on Tuesday against the risk of heat stroke in Tokyo and areas in the east and the west, asking people to avoid physical activity, while local media reports says that scores of people have been hospitalized, while some have died from heat stroke and symptoms over the last few days. Temperatures hit a record 40 degrees Celsius on Monday, July the 8th, in the city of Shizuoka, while other areas, some in Tokyo, have witnessed record temperatures for the first time this year. Eyewitness drone video shot on Monday shows water completely flooding the city of Houston after the deadly tropical storm Beryl ripped through southeast Texas. At least 3 people were killed after Beryl brought howling winds and torrential rain to the state. And the storm has inundated highways, closed oil ports, halted over 1,300 flights, knocking out power for almost 2.7 million homes and businesses. The U.S. National Hurricane Center says the Beryl, the season's earliest Category 5 hurricane on record, weakened from a hurricane after pounding the coastal Texas town with dangerous storms, surges, and heavy rain before moving across Houston. We told you earlier about security measures being heightened and tightened around the D.C. Convention Center that is playing host to the NATO summit, for the 75th anniversary of the NATO, primarily held at the Washington Convention Center and other locations, including the White House, is expected to bring significant traffic impact, including street and pedestrian closures. But let's bring in now Maria Bird, our Washington correspondent, to tell us more about that event holding in Washington. Hello, Maria, and thank you for joining us on The World Today.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very well, and I'm sure you are too, as you are within the city where the NATO summit holds today. Is there a sense of expectation from the American people? What could be realized from the summit?
Well, the American people are a bit concerned about their foreign relations. And as you mentioned, this is the 75th anniversary, and there has been heightened security throughout Washington. It has been very hard to move throughout the city since yesterday as a result of this summit. But the hope is that we know that this treaty has been in existence for quite some time, and we know that the U.S. has had major allies, but we're in a very pivotal time as it relates to the state of the United States. We're in the middle of an election season, and foreign relations continues to be of a top priority for Americans, especially as we know our involvement with the war in Israel, Gaza, and also obviously with our support for Ukraine has been. So I think this is going to really be a true test for the Biden administration as they look for re-election to see how they respond and what they're able to actually accomplish as they have so many of the world leaders here.
All right, Maria, President Joe Biden is hosting this summit, but he does have a lot to worry about. Some Democrats are really working to have him replaced as candidate for the party. They have even touted VP Kamala Harris as a possibility. But why are members so anxious about Mr. Biden's capabilities now? Have there been other instances where maybe he may have put the country in jeopardy?
I think the real concern at this time as it relates to the current president for some Democrats, I don't say many because we have heard from several of the leaders that have said they are supporting the president, but the concern is really around the actual November election day. The concern is whether or not he will be able to beat the Republican candidate, the former President Trump. And I think that's where the concern comes, is his ability to be able to be seen by the American people as the best candidate. And so that is where some of the angst and anxiety is coming from. Obviously, we've heard the vice president's name being put out there as potentially one that they might ask to be the actual nominee for the party. And we are getting very close to the Democratic National Convention where the nominee is actually voted on by the Democratic Party. And so we're in very interesting times, and every day we're learning more things about where especially the senators, congressional members, are standing as it relates to the president and their support of him, or potentially their thought to move another candidate to the forefront.
Maria, from what you're hearing and what you're seeing, what is the highlight of the NATO summit?
Well, the highlight is really going to be around when we look at the security around the borders. Those are obviously major concerns. When we look at the war and what we're seeing out of Gaza and Israel, those are going to be highlighted areas. And obviously Ukraine as well. But it's really going to be around really strengthening the alliances that exist, strengthening the treaty, and obviously being very commemorative around the 75th anniversary. The president's going to lean very heavily on that, the historical nature of this, and the long-standing relationship that has been in place with the U.S. and those that are part of NATO.
But there's talk that President Joe Biden will be meeting the new British Prime Minister on the sidelines of that summit. I mean, we know U.S.-Britain relations have come a long way since Boris Johnson. Do you think that both leaders could find that sweet spot again between leadership and friendship?
Well, I think the president hopes so. I think the president sees that they will be able to. I think that the president foresees, especially leaning on some of the partnership that has existed for many years, but also some of the partnership that is currently existing as we look at some of the major challenges across the world and how the two countries have come together in support of various countries. And so I think that's going to be where he's going to lean upon. Obviously, there's going to be much that's going to come out of that meeting, and there'll be probably very clear, substantive action point that we will definitely hear from those.
Well, let's talk about the concern. We've heard also about the attacks on Ukraine. Apart from condemning the Russian airstrikes, what other support is the United States offering to Ukraine at this point?
Well, we know the U.S. has provided a lot of financial support. They've provided military support, and I think they've also are going to be considering strategic support. Now, boots on the ground are still not within the conversation for the U.S. president or his administration, and so it's really going to continue to be some of the strategic, some of the financial, and again, military support.
So you're saying NATO allies will be rethinking new strategies for Ukraine?
Yes, the strategies obviously allies are going to be a huge part of that, looking at the United States allies to be able to strategically position themselves in support of Ukraine, knowing that, as you mentioned, these airstrikes are ones that are very aggressive in nature and ones that could potentially put Ukraine at even greater risk.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Maria Bird, our Washington correspondent. We'll definitely be hearing from you later on developments of that summit. Thanks a lot. Let's talk other stories now. In Sudan, the Ethiopian Prime Minister has met with the head of Sudanese Army Forces, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. This visit is coming amid continued fighting across the country. Prime Minister Abiy becomes the first foreign leader to visit General al-Burhan in this war in Port Sudan since the start of the conflict between the army and the paramilitary rapid support forces, the RSF. Mr. Abiy, who was previously seen as closer to the RSF than the army and hosted its leader, Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, in Addis Ababa in December, framed the visit as part of a push to bring stability to Sudan after nearly 15 months of conflict. This war between the Sudanese military factions have forced almost 10 million people from their homes. It has created famine-like conditions in parts of the country and has threatened to destabilize the region. The head of the UN force in the Democratic Republic of Congo says that the humanitarian truce in its effect in the eastern region of the country, but the situation remains alarming given the rebels' territorial gains. Updating the Security Council on her mandated activities, Bintu Keita, who is also the head of the UN stabilization mission in DRC, expressed grave concern. She also highlighted the humanitarian catastrophe there.
The situation in eastern DRC has continued to deteriorate, reaching alarming levels of violence and civilian displacement. I am extremely concerned about the rapid expansion of the movement du 23 Mars M23 in North Kivu and the spillover in South Kivu, despite numerous operations conducted by the FRDC, regularly supported by MONUSCO and SAMI DRC. The DRC today counts 7.3 million displaced people, including 6.9 million in the eastern provinces alone. International humanitarian law violations are impeding humanitarian aid delivery. The growing proximity of the front lines and the presence of weapons, including heavy artillery, within and around displacement camps and spontaneous sites significantly compromise the security of the displaced and resident population. What is sadly more is that gender-based violence does not stop to increase. For the whole year of 23, 122,960 cases of gender-based violence were reported, marking a 3% increase from 22.
I wish to conclude by expressing once again Rwanda's support for regional initiatives, especially the Nairobi and Rwanda peace processes. Rwanda strongly appeals to the international community to support these regional efforts, which focus on political solutions, including the need for political dialogue, and the need to permanently address the issues of the FDLR by disarming, demobilizing, and repatriating them to Rwanda.
And from there, we head to India. The government has launched the world's first compressed natural gas-powered motorcycle. The motorcycle, named Freedom 125, was designed by India-based manufacturer Bajaj Auto and unveiled by Indian Transport Minister Nitin Gadkari at the launch ceremony in Pune in the western state of Maharashtra. Mr. Gadkari said the Freedom 125 will be the cost-efficient as CNG is cheaper than petrol and diesel in India. It is going to save not only the environment from pollution, but it is also going to save the imports. Pollution is a growing problem across India. Attempts to cut vehicle emissions, reduce fuel imports and curb stubble burning have not yielded positive results in the country, where the proposed coal power capacity is the highest after China.
For petrol two-wheeler, the cost is coming something 2.25 rupees. And for the CNG vehicle, the cost is coming nearly 1 rupees per kilometer. That is to be great saving. I am really happy about it. It is going to save not only pollution, but it is going to save our imports.
Let's check out something more colorful. From the diva commanding the stage to a punk rock-loving hooligan, a new generation of clowns took to the stage on Monday night at the start of the London Festival, celebrating contemporary clowning. Running until July the 26th, the London Clown Festival showcases clowning and physical performance from Britain and, of course, other countries. Festival Artistic Director Dan Lees, who launched the festival back in 2016, says that clowning is a resurging art form. The festival's lineup includes the silent clowning act Furioso, described as an aggressive hooligan with a heart giant, and a diva, Madame Senorita, who teases her audience. Riz Obolensky, who hosted Monday's opening at the Soho Centre in central London, says the public's perception had changed as clowning has evolved away from the traditional stereotypes.
Well, it's a festival of contemporary clowning, and it surprises people because obviously people think about clowning, they think of a red nose or makeup, or they may be a children's entertainer. They might be surprised that a lot of our clowns don't wear makeup, and they come in all shapes and sizes, and there's all kinds of, we use all kinds of theatre, comedy, and yeah, it draws on anything influenced by clowning, contemporary clowning. Often in the media, often in the mainstream, it's conveyed that clowning is a kind of dying art form, and that clowns are not finding work. And it's often the story. Often I've been asked to appear in stories which have been very negative about clowning, how it's a dying art form, when in fact it's a resurging art form from our perspective.
It's never the same, and it's not safe. You really need to love danger. It's always a bet. It can go really, really well, and people will love you, and they will probably remember you. And if it goes wrong, people will hate it. Clowning cannot be a middle ground. Either or you love the performer, or it's really painful to watch.
Well, I guess that's the beauty of art. And on that note, we draw the cuttings on today's edition of The World Today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Anne Nwawadu.